So now the question is, which side are you on?
Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on? No matter what, which side are you on, boy?
I love this. This is the first time we've had a serious graphic on this show. That isn't some wanky pull thing. I love it.
So this is a tool that we use when we train activists, and it's called the Spectrum of Allies. It's actually called a lot of things. This has been for many decades used.
Can you describe it visually for somebody who's listening versus watching?
I will.
Okay.
It's been used at like the Highlander Center that like Dr. King and Rosa Parks studied at. It's been used I learned it from the Ruckus Society. And basically, if you're listening in, it looks like half a pizza pie, basically, where there's like 5 slices. So if you like draw a circle and draw a line in half, if you're listening, it might even be useful to just like draw it on a page of paper if you want. But here's how it works. This is like helps you map the terrain if you're building a campaign or assessing movement strategy. And there's multiple applications. So on the left wedge, those are your active allies. So that's where you would map and list all the institutions, all the social blocks or key individuals that on your issue that you're fighting on are on your side and actively fighting, right? So that might be allied organizations, that might be your own base, etc. Then next is your passive allies. These are people who agree with you, but they're not taking action.
So you're watching on YouTube, but you haven't gone to patreon.com/TMBS. Get the fuck on it.
Yeah.
All right, I get it. I can use this pizza pie.
Yeah, take action.
All right.
I am a patron. Join me.
Indeed. There you go.
So your passive allies don't need to read your like newspaper.
Right.
They already agree with you. What they need is a doorway into action. They need a credible plan that they can see themselves a part of, right? They need a pathway and an opportunity to take action, right? Next is your neutrals. Those are our favorite fence sitters or people who don't know or don't care or are ambivalent. Then is the passive opposition.
Can I ask a real question? Question? How relevant is it to distinguish inside the neutrals between a don't care versus a don't know or like genuinely conflicted? Because it seems to me those are 3 really different things.
Yeah. Okay. I'll get to it more.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But one of the things about the neutrals is that's a category that when you're building a strategy, a lot of your I don't know goes here. And you then identify which neutrals matter to figure out. So one of the many ways that you use this tool is it lets you know what research to do in order to do a campaign.
Got it.
But let's talk more about that. So then is your passive opposition. These are people who are against you, but they're not actively trying to out-organize you and are mostly just noise, right? And so a lot of activists get really distracted by their passive opposition, not realizing that their passive opposition isn't in an institutional position to stop them, right? And then finally is your active opposition. These are the people who are actively organizing against you, or they are power holders trying to maintain their power and stop you, yeah? And so another mistake activists make is they either hang out in the active allies category and just talk to themselves, right? And don't think about anybody else, or they act like everyone is in the active opposition, which you know, like when I mentioned like the war in Iraq, you know, like when I was marching in the streets with hundreds of thousands of students, we were chanting and screaming as if everyone was George Bush, not realizing that like most of the country was actually like shell shocked and in trauma from 9/11 and didn't know what to think and was highly influenceable and believed in weapons of mass destruction. We weren't talking to them at all. We were like just yelling at our active opposition, right? So what this tool helps you do is helps you map a campaign by getting really specific. I hear activists all the time saying like, we can't do this because it would alienate the public, or how do we reach the public? There is no the public. There's only a balance of forces in society that you can actually map, and that by literally putting this on the wall and doing this, you find out what you know and what you don't know, and you figure out who has the power. So I'll give one historical case study, and then we can play with an example and maybe talk about Lula. So before we go to the second graphic, what's the example? So let's talk about SNCC. So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was the engine of the early civil rights movement in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And in the very early 60s, they were organizing a campaign that was registering black voters in the South. And they were experiencing extreme violence. They were experiencing lynchings. They were getting jailed. They were getting beaten. And they busted out a chart basically like this. And they mapped out, okay, we've exhausted the capacity of our base down here in Mississippi. We can't, there's no more muscle to flex. We're flexing our muscle as much as possible. And when they mapped it out, they said, all right, there's students, university students in the North who are like mad passive allies. Like they agree with us, they're down, they don't need to be like convinced, but they don't have any way to support us. Right. So we're going to do a campaign called Freedom Summer, where we send buses up to the North and students, mixed race students, black students and white students, although the white ones are mostly Jewish. Yeah.
You hear that, guys? You hear that? That's right. Thank you, Joshua.
Came down to the South. Yeah. Right. And spent the summer engaging in that struggle. And a lot of those white students, for the first time in their lives, had their eyes opened to the realities of white mob violence, of KKK infiltration of the police, and a lot of them themselves were getting brutalized. Yep. And so that was one way that you created this pathway from passive allies to active allies, right? Then what happened was a lot of those students wrote letters home to mom and dad, and a lot of their parents had personal connection to the struggle suddenly, and could experience not just empathy, but also those parents were part of social institutions. They were part of PTAs, they were part of unions, they were part of professional associations, they were part of sewing circles. Right. And many of those were either neutral or apolitical, and because of the personal connection could get politicized and move from neutral to passive allies. Or some of them were even passive opposition, and it humanized an experience of not thinking like the Black South like it was some foreign country or something like that, and brought it home in a different kind of way. And there were shifts from passive opposition to neutral. And so if you go to the next graphic, if you're listening in, you see just a bunch of arrows shifting all of these blocks to the left. And so the lesson here is that movements often don't win by like going directly after the active opposition and beating and overpowering it, but by shifting the support out from under it, by assessing where are the social blocks in society and getting them to move one square to the left. And it helps us think about strategy, because we don't necessarily need every single one of these groups to shift all the way into active allies, right? If we can get each of them to shift one to the left, it builds our base, which means we have muscle to flex, which means we can contest for power. And it means the active opposition gets out of the way so that the active opposition doesn't have a resource to draw from and they get isolated. In doing so, you create this cascading waterfall of support, and you don't need to focus on convincing someone far to your right to join your position, and you don't need to get all pissed off if they're not all the way on your side. Right. Because if you get MoveOn.org, like radicals talk about how centrist MoveOn is and how they're not really on our team and they've co-opted blah 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 whatever. You don't need MoveOn to become like a self-identified revolutionary organization. If you can organize in a way that shifts them one to the left, you then create a different balance of forces in the country, which is what, for example, like this latest cohort of new congresswomen are doing. Right. It helps you think about engaging institutions like the Democratic Party in a strategic way, where you're thinking about how do we shape our terrain so that it's on our side. So do you want to play a game with it, or do you want to talk about Lula?
Well, I want to. We could play. No, I mean that's actually great. Maybe we'll do Lula in the post game. But I do want. I want to underline it because I think there's maybe some relevance in how this Venezuela thing has been going. Yeah. And I just want to say specifically, you see this process with Chris Murphy. He's a great example because you have this. I mean, first you have probably most people in the country are neutral. There's a fair amount passive opposition. And then there's a fair amount of passive allies because they just don't want more U.S. engagement. They don't want any more troops, frankly, to die for any type of stupid foreign adventure, whatever it may be. When people on the left constructively pushed, and Ro Khanna, to his credit, was the first one that came out and said, we should not do this, right? And then and then because he did that, and then Ilhan Omar, she was very strong, and then, AOC kind of went there, and Bernie kind of went there. But what really hit me was when Chris Murphy, who's been great on Yemen, but he's definitely, he is a liberal versus these other politicians trying to occupy a more sort of social democratic space. He did that tweet thread on the problem with the caravan. And I don't know if you caught that, but it was very, it was very modulated language, but he was like, all right, guys. He even said, like, let's think about this for a second. Let's see what the trouble this might get us into, even if it's well-intentioned. And when I saw that, I definitely was like, whoa, we are really, like, that's terrain shifting. Now, obviously, because of the institutional arrangement, Rubio and Trump and Bolton and, these ghouls are going to keep pushing for this. But would that be the kind of example that you're talking about?
Yeah. And it allows you to declare that as a victory, right? And because there's this problem that social movements have where, like, we have trouble declaring victory when we get it because it's not perfect.
Right.
And on the other hand, sometimes declaring a victory when it's not complete does pull oxygen out of a movement. We experienced this on Keystone XL, where, like, we experienced a real defeat. It was a partial victory. We were not sure how to call it. And some of the energy dissipated by trying to celebrate a victory, but some of the energy might have dissipated by not celebrate, and having an orientation towards this, at least with your base, allows you to see, okay, them moving, it is a victory because it changes the terrain, not because it's sufficient, and it allows you to see yourself on a pathway. But you can only see yourself on the pathway if you have a North Star, if you have vision, Yeah.
In the last couple of minutes before we go to the post game, and you will stay with us for the post game.
Sure. Yep.
Please, if you can. How does this relate to the exiting the Vampire Castle stuff and dealing with all of the problems inside the culture of the left? And again, I don't usually some of these things manifest as like Marxist versus identity and all this stuff, which, and again, I'll sound like, Bill Clinton. I don't buy these false categories. Like, I think it's obviously these are integrated and interdependent process. But I do see across the board, and I'm sure I've made plenty of mistakes myself, really, really toxic, really, really moralizing, and sometimes even like cultish subcultures, which are creating unhealthy internal cultures, and also, I think, even undermining their own processes of people actually being able to have the space to do the work on themselves, to become the kind of people that these movements might want us to be. Because if everything is constantly, a call out and so on, then, well, you just have to, I've got to pretend that I'm perfect. And of course nobody is. So, like, how does this relate to the Vampire Castle stuff? What's your kind of perspective on that?
Yeah, this gets to the heart of what the Wildfire Project's work is around helping heal movement cultures. I actually don't know the Vampire Castle reference.
Oh, I'll send that to you. I'm sorry. It's a Mark Fisher essay called Exiting the Vampire Castle. Unfortunately, he took his life several years ago. But it's it's basically is about the kind of toxicity of online left stuff, basically. But
yeah, it's there's so one of the things we've talked about before is, like, if you don't have an arena where you feel like you can exercise power, you're going to exercise power in whatever way you can, including punching the person next to you in the meeting because you disagree with them a little bit.
Right.
And I liked what you were saying earlier in the show about buzzword signifiers, and to me, part of what we're talking about here, like, this is kind of a populist tool in a way, right?
Yep.
And one of the key things that we're challenged with in social movements is defining the we, like, who's the us and who's the them, right?
Right.
And which is, you had mentioned earlier talking about the role of, like, consciousness or political education in social movements. And if you define the we, the us, so small that it's only your little subculture, you're going to zoom in on the wrong things and fight each other over the purity of politics and build the circular firing squads of call out culture. If you define the we so big, you have no compass whatsoever.
Right.
And
then you don't protect your own people, and you don't, because again, it's it's not like just forget about it, just do whatever. It is a dialectic, like you're saying.
Exactly,
Right. Right.
And politics are about having a material analysis to assess your terrain, because your choices. So, for example, when Beto was running in Texas, I was so excited.
Right. Absolutely.
Because that would both take obviously a crack at the Republican establishment if he were able to win. It would also take a crack at the Democratic establishment because he was much more progressive than centrists believe is possible to win in a red state, and it breaks that formula.
Right.
And so him winning in Texas moves our objectives forward. Beto running in the national election is against our objectives. It undermines our objectives. He's the same guy. Right? So if your politics are just this individual, like, I don't know, whatever, Jimmy Dore, like kind of like, oh, I'm just gonna get, did I hit a hot button?
Love it.
We could, talk
Joshua Kahn's a fucking sellout.
like
The
if
Wildfire
you're so-
Project, I don't know. It's a lot of fishy stuff that they're doing rent strikes, but they didn't say a fucking thing about Tulsi Gabbard.
So
I'm suspect of that. This is that to me. This is red flaggy all over the place.
Red flaggy. Yeah. So if you're zoomed into like whether Beto is like, if it's about Beto, you have no political compass, right?
Right.
But if you have a map of the terrain, then you're like, like actually just to say another thing about Jimmy Dore to kind of land it, which was, it's a good example of why you need political education and consciousness and movements, because when he, like in the 2016 primary, when he was raging against Hillary, I was like, yeah, this guy is funny. This is like, I loved his show. Right. And
definitely, right.
it was hilarious. And he was like pissed. I was like, here's a liberal who's starting to move to a radical politic because he's becoming disillusioned with the Democratic Party. Right. And like, that's the appropriate time to rage against Hillary. Then when the general election starts and the candidate is Hillary, your option is to choose your battlefield, and I choose the Hillary battlefield.
Right,
and if you can't make that distinction, it's because you're not assessing the terrain, and you don't have a view. Like, I was like, oh, this dude's just getting so upset about the Democratic Party because he feels betrayed by them.
Right.
I don't feel betrayed by the Democratic Party because I don't feel a part of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, well, when were we friends to begin with?
Yeah.
They're the fucking Democratic Party.
Yeah. So
they
instead,
are a corporate, capital-driven, imperial-minded institution that I have to wrestle with because of the institutional realities of modern America.
And so what you're doing then is looking at the Democratic Party as a site of struggle that is not a monolith, that has avenues where we can shift folks over, and is the institutional terrain that we're on, and has real barriers. And then you play the fields, and you look at it as a playing field, not as like who's like righteous, and because they're fundamentally not on our team, even if we're choosing to engage that vehicle, and even if we have team members on the field wearing their jerseys, which we do.
Right.
And so that's, I don't know if that gets at
No,
what
that's
you're saying
really,
with the
no, I
insularity
think
thing,
and I think that runs the terrain. That's perfect. All right. Joshua has another lesson for us. And this is using The Simpsons to solidify this lesson. So want to start setting it up for us while Matt gets the graphic?
Sure.
Or here it is. Go for it.
Cool. So
Wanna
if
throw
you're
the
just
graphic
tuning
back
into
up,
the
guys?
post game and didn't hear it before, what we have in front of us is it's like half a pizza pie where there are 5 slices, and what we're going to do is map our terrain using this tool. So I'm going to ask you, Michael, to map out. This is an exercise I do with groups sometimes that have a hard time, that maybe don't have a lot of experience with actions. And you're familiar with The Simpsons?
Yeah. I'm sure I'm like this less of a Simpsons head than many people in the audience, but I know the characters.
Enough. That's that's all that matters.
Yeah.
So let's say that we live in Springfield, we're in The Simpsons, and Lisa has a campaign to shut down the nuclear power plant.
All right, sounds good.
So Lisa is obviously active
And
ally.
then we're about to get like 50 Discord. Like, that Lisa's gonna hurt the fight against climate change.
Does Lisa
totally unscientific?
Does Lisa know about thorium?
All right, so stipulate that Springfield's not dealing with a climate crisis, but it's dealing with a negligent nuclear power plant. Okay, Lisa wants to shut down the power plant. Yes, we have Lisa.
So we're mapping out her campaign.
Okay, great.
Where would Marge go?
Passive ally, I would think.
Why?
I think, if I recall from the show, Marge usually gets to the right place. She's pretty smart. She seems like she has some empathy, but she's obviously, an overworked, lower middle class. Does she have a job too? I know she takes care of everybody in the house.
I think the complicating factor is her
incredibly
husband's
incompetent
job.
husband.
So
That's true.
So she might be.
Because
So we
power
know.
plant.
Yeah. So Homer works at that power plant. So she
I'm
might
sorry.
be passive opposition.
I think we're gonna
maybe.
need Matt on this. She's passive opposition,
or neutral. Passive opposition to neutral.
Yeah, or she's gonna be super torn. Ooh, I don't even know how to answer that. Matt.
So
I think Matt should be definitely be in on this process.
Yeah,
because I'm not
definitely.
Simpsons oriented enough.
Okay, so we're landing Marge somewhere between passive allies and neutral because she's the mother of Lisa. She has moral values, but her husband works for the plant. So let's talk about him. Matt, where does Homer go?
I would say he's at possibly active opposition, but he's kind of a lazy guy. So maybe he's passive opposition, and he'll go with the flow if the power plant shuts down.
Why?
Why would he be passive?
Yeah.
Because I think that just the laziness. Maybe
He likes to
care.
drink. Doesn't he just like to drink beer and watch
He'd be
TV?
like one of these guys. Like he'd be a Trump voter whose factory gets shut down immediately. After.
Okay.
So there's some debate about Homer. Yeah, he could he could also be neutral, right? Because so he has a material self-interest, right? He works for the power plant, and if it gets shut down, he's out of a job. He's also the father of Lisa. He also doesn't like his job.
Yeah, he hates his job.
He hates it.
He
right?
hates his job, and he does love and respect his daughter. Isn't that one of the things of the show that he kind of gets, that even though she's like 8, she's much more intelligent than he is?
Yeah. So
Right.
so what we notice from
Yes.
using this tool is that Homer has conflicting self-interest, right? As most people do.
Well, as does Marge, of course.
As does Marge.
Right.
Homer's are a little more material because it's his job, but
Yes.
it's basically the same for her, right?
Right.
And so if you're organizing,
And I don't know,
like,
does she have her own job, or is that
I
the
think
sole source of income?
I don't think so. I think he's the sole source of
Oh,
income.
okay,
Right?
that's
So-
heavy. That's a lot.
So if we were mapping this campaign out and wanted to organize Homer, what we would notice is he's got forces pulling him in one direction and the other direction, right? And so what we would want to do is enhance the things that pull him to the left, and then figure out what does he need to neutralize the things that are pulling him to the right, which is a different job, right?
Right.
And so immediately we would know, okay, we need like a green jobs campaign, right? And we
Right.
need to organize with the workers of this power plant. If we just shut it down and let workers high and dry, where not only is that not part of our theoretical politics, but it also, you can't win the campaign, right? And so, but maybe actually Homer's like an idiot and like a doofus, and we don't care about him in particular, but we do care about the other workers. So Matt, where are Lenny and Carl at?
Ooh, I don't know.
This
those
is
guys.
where we're pushing
too
up
much?
on my limit of Simpsons knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we find Lenny and
I
Carver?
know. I could imagine Mr. Burns probably invested in the power plant. He'd be active opposition.
Wait. No, those are just but like. All right, I don't know much about them, but I'm assuming they're Homer's workmates, right?
Yeah, they also work there.
They're stablemates.
They also work there.
So are they like smarter, or like do they have different character traits than him, or
yeah,
are they
they're
just
smarter. We care more about them, let's say. And so let's say we put them in neutral because we don't know.
Yeah, we
right?
don't know.
So
we don't know
if-
enough
if we
about
don't
them. We need to
know-
do a poll.
Right. So where would we do a poll? Do we know where they hang out?
They hang out at the bar, right?
Yeah, at Moe's, right?
All right. We got to send David Grisham to Moe's.
So
That's the only thing I know.
so we don't know where Moe's at either. But what this tool helps us do is realize, okay, there's a social institution.
Well, Moe's going to be worried because if all these guys lose their job, he'll have a job concern too.
That's
if they
right.
will lose their
Yeah,
job,
yeah,
they're
yeah.
not going to go buy beer to drink their misery away.
Exactly.
Yes.
So we're worried about getting Moe's approval, right? We don't know
Right.
where he would land on here necessarily. We know that there might be a fear, but we do know that the only institution that they're connected to outside of the power plant is that bar. And so if we want to be able to organize with workers, we need to actually be able to have access to that space. So it doesn't matter where they're at yet, but it does matter where Mo is. And so what this chart would help us do in the campaign is identify, okay, Mo's a key person to connect with because that institution is necessary to build a base with the workers of this power plant so that we can enlist them in the campaign, right? And so we don't know where he might land, but so one of the uses of this tool is to discern, right, which audiences, which groups, which social blocks are important priorities for our campaign because a campaign is a timeline, right? And so the bar comes first, right? So you mentioned Burns, so Burns is obviously active opposition, right? So it's obvious that we're not going to win the campaign by like changing Mr. Burns's heart.
Although if you talk to, and this is I shouldn't name it, but if you talk to some pundits who are maybe less politically sophisticated, they will tell you that the campaign starts with Lisa going to Mr. Burns and persuading him to do the right thing. So that's actually still a belief that's out there.
Yeah.
Crazily
Well,
enough.
what's interesting about that belief is I actually think that that's a necessary step in a campaign.
Okay.
Because you actually have to go to the power holder,
Right.
try to persuade them, have them say no, and then you have a
then
basis to
filter it.
organize
I
people,
see.
right? Because then
I
you're
see.
like, they won't respond. If you don't do that,
Right.
people are like, why are you like getting all upset? Why don't you just ask?
Oh, that's
So
fascinating.
you don't go because you think they're going to say yes. You go because you build a tool that you can use to educate your base, to build your muscle, to leverage your pressure.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So he's active opposition. Mo's is the key place we need to figure out where Mo's at. And that's where we're going to get our raw political intelligence.
Who else might be active opposition?
Burns's assistant guy who's in love with him.
Smithers.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Why?
Well, he's quite emotional. Actually, like all kidding aside, if I recall correctly, he's quite emotionally attached to Mr. Burns. So
Yeah.
it's not only a job thing for him, because if it was a job thing, maybe he could be, particularly him, because presumably he might have more job prospects as a more like, educated, credentialed kind of person. But he actually seems to have a real emotional connection
Yeah.
with
yeah.
Mr. Burns.
Yeah, he's
So that
totally in
might
love with him.
supersede everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Although,
But
Bur-
Mr. Burns doesn't treat him well.
no. And he's been, this is like maybe Simpsons trivia that's a little in the weeds, but he's disagreed with Burns privately before, right? And so he's not always down. And even if the plant's shut down, Burns is rich. He's still going to need an assistant. He's not out of a job.
True.
So Smithers, we don't know, but there's a chance that Smithers might be actually sympathetic, but would never do it publicly. Right. I've been on real campaigns before, and I could like give an example if you want,
Please.
where we have had an inside person in the company who has to have public allegiances to the company that we're campaigning against, but will feed us inside information. And that identifying those people is key. And so if we were mapping this out, we could identify Smithers as potentially that person. And maybe he won't go for it, but it's worth a shot,
Definitely.
And that also goes back to what we were saying before of like, it's about finding the strategic roles for these folks based on their relationship to power. Like, we don't need Smithers to go out and like declare that he's against the power
No.
plant, right?
Not at
What we
all.
actually need is him to stay close to Burns and to give us the information we need. That's the key role he can play, right? And so when we use this kind of tool, we can get actually really specific and targeted with the kind of work we're doing, which is what we did with, it'd be kind of a larger story that if you want me to tell, I can tell after this, but we went after the Royal Bank of Canada for their funding of the tar sands, which is like the largest oil reserve on the planet.
Right.
And they're sort of steamrolling indigenous communities. And having an inside person was key to us getting the information we needed to have a smart strategy. Yeah. So yeah, maybe we're kind of running this out. There's
All right,
we
so
could
what
play
about
this
my
for a
favorite
I
long
got
time.
one more.
character was-
Krusty.
Yeah.
Krusty goes to Moe's.
Krusty
He's
goes.
probably
What about Bart?
Yeah. What about Bart?
I was gonna say that's really hard because he's either active opposition because he's just wants to beef with his sister, but on the other hand, I feel like Bart has great anti-establishment instincts.
Yeah.
and at the end of the day loves his sister.
I mean, he
and would l-
skateboards through the
and he-
skateboards through the power plant.
So he's
doesn't he?
cool.
Yeah.
So basically, I actually think he is a very. I'm going to go with actually at the end of the day active ally who could be enlisted.
Or at least passive initially. Yeah.
Well, passive initially, but I'm thinking like if you went to him with the right like, this is a way to like skateboard through the power plant.
Do a kickflip in the reactor.
Yeah.
Do it. He's going to be.
He's good with the slingshot.
Yup.
He's good with the spray paint can.
Yup.
Right.
He's a culture jammer.
He's a culture jammer. And
Yeah.
so this is so a lot of activist groups are like, "Oh, we don't want to do this tactic because it'll alienate people." That is like a non-comment. like any tactic you do will attract some people and repel others, right? And so if we're running a direct action campaign specifically against the power plant, we might want the Barts on our side. And so we might want to do confrontational direct action because he actually has skills that we can use, even though because he might not actually like follow the group, he might not stay in discipline. There's a cost potentially to it,
Right.
but it might be worth it. And so if we pick a tactic to attract the Barts of the world, right, that will enhance that piece. Or if we're picking a different route because we have a different strategy and we want to organize the church, right, we would want a tactic that, I don't know, gets like Reverend Lovejoy involved, right, because he has this connection to the church. And so it's not that like tactics are neutral, and it depends on your strategy. And what charts like this help you do is assess, okay, based on our strategy, what tactic will be a different push or pull factor for here. So if we mapped out like the church on here in Reverend Lovejoy, if we mapped out whatever, Krusty the Clown, if we
Go to
mapped out the
Krusty
bus
and tell him
driver,
that it's a PR coup for him.
there you go.
Krusty would love it.
So and like it basically gives you a sense of your terrain and helps you understand like there's costs and benefits to any choice and any tactic, and your calculus is based on either building power because you don't have enough of it, or wielding power because you do have enough of it. And all of those calculuses are different. And I'm trying to think. There was one other kind of character on my mind, but I might have lost it. Oh, yeah. I guess the last like element that's worth mentioning is the mayor, Quimby.
Oh, right.
Where do you think he would go?
You he's totally neutral in the sense of, well, no. I would have to imagine that in such a small town running a machine, he's got funding from someone like Mr. Burns.
Yeah, power plants run small towns.
Right.
Right.
On the other hand, the way he's written is, he's some type of Kennedy figure. So presumably if Mose decided that they were anti-power plant, he'd at least have to pretend.
Yeah.
So I would say but he's super sneaky. He might be the opposite of the inside track you talked about before.
Right,
he might be the opposite of Smithers.
Yeah,
he might
yeah,
be
yeah.
the active supporter who's really active ally who's really like secretly plotting with Burns about how to water the whole thing down. So I would be
Yeah,
very
yeah.
wary of him.
So we can never trust him to be on your team, on our team. is what you're
I mean,
saying.
not that you couldn't use him, but I would never. No, I wouldn't put trust in him. I would not.
Right.
He seems very hacky, and ultimately Burns still has the checkbook.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. And he is, a poll monger, right?
Right.
And so the difference between him, so let's say what you just described is like he could kind of be anywhere on here depending on what's in his immediate self-interest that we only maybe sort of know.
Right.
And so Burns, because he has a deep, obvious structural interest in the power plant, we're never going to win by changing his mind.
Right.
So we shouldn't waste time on him. But Quimby, on the other hand, is highly influenceable based
Right.
on the direction of the wind. And so if we had a campaign where we needed a villain, like someone to vilify in our campaign, I wouldn't pick Burns because Burns he's happy to be a villain.
Gives a fuck. Right.
Right. But Quimby would actually be receptive to pressure. Right? And so this also helps you with target selection and figuring out with clarity who are your primary targets, who are the secondary targets that it can influence that target, and who's not movable, right? And so it's a really dynamic tool that you can use in 1,000 different ways. But the reason why I like it is it helps you figure out what research you need to do, figure out both who are you trying to organize, but then also clarify your targets.
And this helps demystify for people why you might target Dianne Feinstein or Nancy Pelosi.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's another typical lazy, like, why they're closer to you.
Go to
Why
Mitch
are you
McConnell.
protesting them?
Yeah.
You should bother Mitch McConnell, who is
exactly.
very much a Burns
who they
figure.
also protested, but people didn't.
Yeah, I
notice.
mean, sure, you should protest him in a different way for different targets. Like Mitch McConnell should never be able to enjoy a meal.
That's the underside of the circle.
Right, exactly. As long as, of course, you're observing the law and not being physical, fuck that guy.
Yeah, don't embarrass us.
Yeah, don't embarrass us, but don't let him ever enjoy a meal.